Those of you that have read John's monograph and have listened carefully know that what he's done here is presented a useful construct for us to be thinking about very plausible events which might force us to consider this more in a more detailed manner. His thoughts, as he mentions, are a framework for us to think about this. So let's pass it over to Brad for comment on his presentation.
Thanks, Bill, and let me begin by thanking both John Harvey and you for hosting this event, and for Ida for welcoming me back. It's a pleasure to see so many familiar faces, and to remember a time when I didn't have gray on my face when I was here. So I imagine watching John go gray over the years here. With pleasure. My sense of our community is that we're all still struggling to figure out, is there a problem here, and if so, what kind of problem? And in general, what we've done as a community is reach back to Cold War models. And we can see that General Gerasimov, for example, has set out a very simple, clear model of this problem. We needed a model. John's given us a model. And I thank you for rising to the occasion to do that. John rightly emphasizes that this is a catalog of concepts. And I want to put the emphasis on the way in which the concepts add up to something more, where the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And the whole is, you know, in my language, many of you have heard me say this, a theory of victory, or a theory of success, or a theory of the case. But what is it a theory of? It's not really a theory of fighting and winning nuclear war. It's a theory of victory, of standing up to the United States in a regional context where there's the possibility that we, because of our inherent power and our numerous allies, are capable of taking that regional conflict in a direction that's threatening a vital interest of theirs, including perhaps regime survival. That's the problem for which they need a theory, that they can go to war against the United States and escape somehow with some interest intact. And I find it useful to distinguish theories of victory in the spirit of Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. And John's emphasized the Clausewitzian aspect. I think Sun Tzu gets his role in this too. And what do I mean by that? If you take the particular view of war that Clausewitz articulated, that war is a continuation of politics by other means, then you also should have a particular view of what victory means. As he spells it out in his book, victory is not when you vanquish your enemy on the battlefield. Victory is when you bring your enemy to a, quote, culminating political point where that enemy is no longer willing to run the costs and risks of continued war. That's what this is. But I think for each of the main actors we worry about, I don't think they're eager to put this theory to the test. They'd like us to admire its perfection and be deterred by their confidence in their theory and its coherence, but they are essentially pursuing in my view, a Sun Tzu theory of victory, meaning they're trying to, in the words of the North Korean leader, break our hostile ways. Seems to have, he might think that he's been successful in doing that. In Mr. Putin's language, it's, quote, snapping back hard against a European security order that he deems inappropriate, unjust, unfair, and thus not durable. And I think there's a similar argument to be made about China, that the theory, that the concepts add up to more than just a military strategy in war. This is a concept that supports the grand strategy objectives, a set of concepts that support the grand strategy objectives of these three states. That's my first of six points, so let me just work down my list. My second is that to recall a point that General Welch will always bring to this discussion, and that John rightly touched on in his summary, but that is we can put all the emphasis we'd like on this new and novel problem, sort of new, sort of novel, at the expense of recalling the centrality of the strategic nuclear balance to their theory of success. They have to believe that they can cap us from doing the most possible damage we might in counter-escalating to their actions. I've heard people argue that, well, if extended deterrence is the main game in the new security environment, then we don't really need to try it anymore, and we could save, gosh, an awful lot of money. And let's nuclear certify some more F-35s and build some more B-61s, and then we can stand down the ICBMs and maybe the bomber force. And that sort of misses the point of you need to do both of these things well. Third point, I make a little more of the, well, I think what perplexed me when I started working in this area is the confidence that these three countries have, or their leaders have, about the credibility that their threats are going to have in our minds. If by their definition the problem is we're the conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power with a lot of allies, somehow they're going to poke us in the eye and get away with it. Well, there's the somewhat arcane logic of nuclear strategy and concepts that John set out. I think there are three underlying asymmetries that they think give them all the credibility they need to threaten us, including with nuclear attack. And these are asymmetry of geography, meaning in a regional war in Europe or Asia, we can't really prevail without going into their homelands. And this opens up the credibility of attacks on the American homeland, and certainly on our allies. So we should have no problem in their eyes in accepting the credibility of their threat to escalate to homeland attacks. Secondly, they emphasize asymmetry of stake. Many of you know of the Track 1.5 dialogue with the Chinese, the PLA, on matters nuclear. There's a favored interlocutor of ours in that process, Major General Yao Yunzhu, PhD, recently took off her uniform in order to have more time to read Shakespeare, very interesting woman. And we've debated for years where the burden of escalation would fall in a war over Taiwan that's gone on a while, and it's starting to tip one way or the other to the advantage of one or the other. Where's the burden of escalation fall? And she summarized this discussion recently by saying, okay, Brad, here's what you said would be the stake of the United States in a conflict it's losing over Taiwan. Your commitment to the people of Taiwan and its government. You're standing in the eyes of your East Asian allies. You're standing in the eyes of your European allies. Mr. Putin's watching, and she said, and you Americans always think you're doing the right thing in the world. 5 big interests. She said, what would China have at stake? Well, we set out 3 core interests, she said, and one is survival of the regime, the continued rule of the Communist Party in China, and secondly, the final recovery from the century of humiliation. Whose interests are more compelling? Ours, not your American ones. You will back down. Balance of power, balance of force, doesn't number of nuclear weapons, presence of capability, doesn't matter. You will back down because your stake doesn't bring you into the game of competing for resolve. And the third asymmetry they tend to emphasize is the asymmetry in our societal structures. Their assessment, the leaders of these countries assess that democracies are weak, easily divided, punch us in the nose, we go home, and generally led by weak people who lack resolve. And thus they can threaten and maybe punch a little bit, and they don't run much risk. I think these are all important aspects of their perception of their credibility. Fourth point, a little pedantic, but in my view, these are nuclear theories of victory, not theories of nuclear victory. Even Russia, okay, in an all-out major war with the West, it's about nuclear warfighting. But the theory of victory is about the ability to keep the war limited and prevail. It's not about extended nuclear warfighting. It's about nuclear blackmail, nuclear brinksmanship, nuclear coercion, and maybe a little nuclear employment to bring yourself some credibility to your threats. Fifth point, this isn't just a nuclear theory of victory, and we shouldn't leave it to the nuclear community to think about this problem of regional wars. I mean, the problem they're trying to solve is us and all of the power assets we would bring to a regional conflict with them, which aren't just nuclear, aren't primarily nuclear. This is a theory of victory of keeping a regional conflict limited but successful. And from my perspective, we need to import the way they have, thinking about all of the non-kinetic means, all of the non-nuclear strategic means, into the manipulation of cost, benefit, and risk in an escalating conflict. We adopted the word cross-domain. None of these three have adopted that term. They either write about integrated strategic deterrence or just plain old strategic deterrence. But we continue to ghettoize the nuclear problem, and they have mainstreamed it. And that's, I think of this as the problem of strategic conflict in the 21st century, not the problem of nuclear war in the 21st century. And lastly, kudos to John for taking on the task of trying to make some constructive recommendations. I think picking up the deterrence calculus framework that is set out in the Joint Operating Concept on Deterrence is a good way to go. I think we should rename it the escalation calculus and de-escalation calculus. The calculus of benefits, costs, and restraints of both action and inaction. We should recognize, though, that, I mean, if what John has done is given us a good model of this problem to wrestle with, we have to appreciate that these three countries set out their model 20, 25 years ago. They have developed these more than concepts, more than a theory of victory. They've now aligned capabilities, organizational structures, exercises, demonstrations, et cetera, to impress upon us their confidence in their concepts and theory. And we, it seems to me, we aren't at square one. And sitting here, it's important to recall that as we call this a new problem, this is the problem that began to take shape immediately in the 1990s upon the end of the Cold War. It's the problem that Saddam first represented to us in a particular way. It's what the counterproliferation agenda was supposed to be about in the 1990s, to reorient our thinking on these problems. And with 9/11, we stopped and went on to different problems. And the summary point for this for me is to look at the new edition of Joint Pub 5.0, the quote, all domain guidance to the joint planner, which, gosh, they keep getting longer. It's 360 pages. The executive summary mentions the word nuclear. The word nuclear again appears on page 56. And then there is an appendix that talks about the need of the combatant commander to anticipate the employment of a nuclear weapon. Not clear if that's red nuclear weapon or a blue nuclear weapon, or why not 5 or why not 15. And for an all-domain document, yes, there are 3 sentences on space. To the best of my quick review, there was no mention of cyber. I don't know, and I know there's other guidance, and I know this is an unclassified document, and I know all of that, but you look at the way in which Russia, China, and North Korea have centralized their thinking around the problem of going to war with us and escaping with their interests intact. We simply haven't applied the horsepower. And John puts us in a good, strong position to start there. This is the fourth in a series of 4 monographs we've so far done in our series. The third was by Dave Johnson, who's the Russian military analyst on the international staff at NATO that looks at this Russian concepts for escalation and de-escalation, nuclear and non-nuclear, in regional war. These two pieces make an excellent side-by-side comparison. And I was looking for a closing concept to explain why we're doing this work. And that many of you will remember Roberta Wolfstetter's fine little study on strategic surprise. Many of you will probably not remember who wrote the preface. A young associate professor at Harvard called Thomas Schelling, who was then just carving out a name for himself, and he said, you know, the problem in the 1930s was that we had lots of data and information, and we simply didn't have the strategic analytical framework into which to plug it. Things that looked to us to be unlikely became in our minds implausible, and we focused on the things that we thought likely and thus became plausible in our minds. I think we're making the same strategic miscalculation today. Not that any country is going to find it easy to cross the nuclear threshold in a war with the United States, but the risks are much higher than most people take, and I think John's done an excellent job of bringing into focus the new challenge in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Great discussion.